Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Anthony Tuck. I'm a professor of classical archaeology and associate dean for faculty and academic affairs at UMass's College of Humanities and Fine Arts. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you all tonight to this fall's capstone event for the Feinberg Family Distinguished Lecture Series, offered every other year by the History Department here at UMass. This year's theme is What Are Universities For? Struggles for the Soul of Higher Education. The various events explore the roots of the political, economic, and ethical crises in higher education. And on behalf of the department, the college, and the university, I extend our gratitude to the esteemed attorney and UMass history alumnus, Kenneth Feinberg, whose generosity makes this series possible. I also thank the faculty and staff in the history department who organized this year's series and the 36 academic partners who have co-sponsored it, among whom I'm proud to share is UMass's College of Humanities and Fine Arts itself. And before going any further, a few brief notes. Live closed captioning is available over Zoom. Please consult the chat for instructions on how to enable it. And if you're a student attending as part of a course, please sign in via the link that we will post in the chat. I invite everyone to visit the Feinberg Series website at www.umass.edu/Feinberg for recordings of this fall's events and to register for the spring 2025 events, which include several panels, a film screening, a student-curated exhibit, and the annual James Baldwin Lecture. UMass and the five colleges UMass and five college students can also find details at the last open classroom day in this semester's Feinberg course series, The Power of Universities. All students are welcome to attend this Wednesday's lecture on inventing student debt. I wish we'd done this 30 years ago, because student debt's been with me for a long time, so that's good. I would also like to acknowledge that UMass Amherst is located on the unceded homelands of the Potawatomi Nation on the land of the Noatak community. Given this year's focus on the role of higher education in society, we might use this occasion to reflect on our university's contributions, to focus on the role of higher education in society, and use this occasion to reflect on our university's contributions to indigenous land dispossession, as well as the carbon pollution, war, and other forms of violence that continue to kill, impoverish, and make refugees of indigenous and non-indigenous communities around the world. We might also recognize the university's enormous capacity to help solve these problems. The series is an invitation to us all to reflect on these questions and get involved in collective movements for justice and repair. Tonight's capstone is titled, What Are the Humanities For? Academic Thought After the Neoliberal University. When the theme of this year's Feinberg series was established, we did not then know how essential a discussion this would prove to be. Some of the challenges we will face in the coming years are known to us. Some are challenges we ourselves have authored. Others are ones that we did not invite and cannot yet fully perceive. All of this makes tonight's discussion and the theme of this year's Feinberg Lecture Series all the more essential. Anger, fear, or frustration are all entirely understandable responses to the uncertainties we now confront. But we cannot allow them to slide into indifference, paranoia, or hopelessness. Through fora like this, through open dialogue and a willingness to be both critical and accepting of criticism, our paths forward will remain pointed toward the illumination we seek as scholars and as educators. I now welcome tonight's moderator, Professor Asheesh Kapur Siddique. Professor Siddique is faculty in the Department of History, co-director of this year's Feinberg series, and author of the newly published work, The Archive of Empire. Professor Siddique.
Thank you, Dean Tuck. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. And thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to introduce the capstone event for the Feinberg series for this fall. We are deeply honored to welcome one of the foremost scholars on the past and present of the university, Dr. Christopher Newfield, Director of Research at the Independent Social Research Foundation in London, and Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Chris has written a trilogy of groundbreaking books on the university as an intellectual and social institution. Ivy and Industry, Business of the Making of the American University, 1880 to 1980, which came out from Duke University Press in 2003. on Making the Public University, the 40-Year Assault on the Middle Class, which came out from Harvard University Press in 2008. And most recently, The Great Mistake, How We Wrecked Public Universities and How We Can Fix Them, from Johns Hopkins University Press in 2016. His research on universities emerges from practical experience with university planning and budgeting through the University of California's Academic Senate and as past president of the Modern Language Association. He is co-author of What Metrics Matter: Academic Life in the Quantified University, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2023, and co-editor of The Limits of the Numerical from University of Chicago Press in 2022. Newfield blogs on higher education policy at Remaking the University and has written for outlets such as the Huffington Post, the Chronicle of Higher Education, and the Boston Review, as well as the Los Angeles Review of Books. A Q&A will follow Dr. Newfield's talk, and we encourage audience members to submit questions at any time during the lecture and during the discussion to follow. Thank you.
Hi, all right. We are live. I'm going to be sharing and unsharing, so it's going to be a little bit back and forth. But hello, everybody. Thank you very much, both of you, for those two introductions. I'm really very glad to be with you all. I wish we were in person because the issues I'm going to be talking about tonight are things that we need to hash out together. And I hope that we'll have chances to do that over the next 4 years of combat and conflict. I mean, this talk is really about taking the next 4 years by the horns. It's partly a response to Trump's election and to the Republicans' full spectrum dominance of the federal government's command structure. But the core problems have been festering for decades. The humanities have been in the right's crosshairs really since the 1960s. The humanities leadership in general has had one historical strategy, and that has been to accommodate the right. That is to plead universal values, to ask that the NEH not be killed, to praise Shakespeare in Arkansas, to recall the better angels, and to beg for mercy. This strategy has kept the humanities in a permanent state of expendability. In part 3 of this talk, I'm going to quantify its financial results, which are very bad. In part 2, I'll say more about the state of play after the election. For the moment, I'll just say that my heart goes out to the targets of Trump's ongoing siege on large sections of our society. The election has offered plenty of reasons to fight, to think clearly, to strategize coherently, and for the first time in the history of the humanities, to organize nationally and build. So first, I'm going to talk about the humanities and society, and I'm going to start with my own history with them, which first landed me in the sciences before I moved on from there to philosophy and literature. I'm going to claim that the humanities fields generate knowledge that large portions of the public actually want. We have to get beneath the level of our stereotyped and desperately simple-minded public discourse for this to become clear. And my overall argument is that the humanities are largely and unjustly shut out of public discourse, but not because we're so liberal, but because we're so poor. I am going to now just show you an outline slide if I can find it here. So you have a sense of, yes, this. It. Was that worth the total killing of the momentum of this talk? I don't know. But that's where we're going to go. Part 3 is going to be about the funding issue that I spent a fair amount of time researching. But it's to be enfolded in this larger question of what the humanities can do both for us and for the world. I'm going to take that down now. Okay. So first section, demand for humanities knowledge. So for my own case, because of my hardcore preschool teacher, an Austrian immigrant to Los Angeles, I learned to read between the ages of 3 and 4, and reading fiction went from entertainment to lifesaver well before my teens. Reading first off involved fantasies of heroism, of saving people or saving the day, fantasies that have never really gone away. The lifesaver phase of reading fiction included fiction's power to articulate my conflicted or tormented inner life. I read people in the act of thinking and saying whatever they needed to think or say about their own torments. The sheer power of articulation was always the attraction. The literary rule was, find the words to think anything. There was a second rule, everyone can do this thinking. Any character could come out of nowhere with a better understanding of what was really going on. Thanks to these two rules, eventually everything could be said and everyone would be involved in the saying. The point of the fictional world was that the verbalized consciousness of everyone was either in this world or fighting its way in from a place of exclusion. So later on, I learned to talk about the unconscious and how writing shadowed it forth, about the destructive powers of shame and fear coming into view through writing. With what results, I always wondered, from all these people doing all this reading. Reading seems passive to non-readers. Reading is in fact the experience of the conditions of both the character's actions and of one's own, including one's own actions in the future. One major condition of action was the process whereby a challenge induces one to think for oneself, to think the unthinkable thing, and therefore to make one's own law for oneself. For children, there was no need for the law of adults. For Black people, there was no need for the law of white people. For women, there was no need for the law of men. For the Muslim, there was no need for the law of the Christian. And the poor had no need for the law of the rich. All fiction was adventure fiction in the sense that at 6 or at 8 or at 18, I read people figuring things out for themselves and then saying what they figured out. Their inner lives were both intensely absorbed with their private moments, and yet were always in dynamic collision with the outside. Kids, pirates, the Hardy Boys, Dr. Dolittle, and later lawyers, addicts, football players, poets, civil rights workers, housewives, farm workers, all were feeling their way to formulating their own advice and then learning how to read the advice of others. So it seemed to me that literature exposed the truth of feelings as such in the bringing of feelings into language, and also exposed the untruth of feelings. One's own feelings weren't truth in literature because they continuously interacted with everyone else's feelings. Feelings were radically intersubjective and contingent on the effects of continuous reciprocity, no matter how unwanted. What affects all clashed together and worked out some new direction. Sorry, when they did this, it was paralyzing and also enabling. Literature was a process in which the subject could come into some kind of autonomy. I learned from literature and then from criticism that the subject's autonomy is not an illusion, though it is constructed through active and continuous engagement with other people. Perhaps one could have personal agency, could have what I later learned to call self-determination, simultaneously, individually, and collectively. When I was 13, my best friend's sister became a first-year student at UC Berkeley. At the first holiday break, she returned with the books from some poli-sci 101 type introductory class on contemporary US society. Her books included Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, Soledad Brother, The Prison Letters of George Jackson, Kwame Ture's Black Power, Angela Davis's Lectures on Liberation, a James Baldwin book whose title I can't remember, Jerry Rubin's Do It, and Claude Brown's memoir, Man-Child in the Promised Land. Her brother and I stole these books from her room and devoured them, page by page and book by book. There were no Edenic unities of consciousness. The books were internally fraught, and we argued about them all the time. They shaped my later reading of the mainstream white literature of self-creation, Thomas Wolfe, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Edith Wharton. Sometimes we talk as though literary study was happening in the university and then was pierced from the outside by the thought and energy of social movements. My experience was the opposite. The social movement was inside literature, in the social problems and the interpersonal relations the work represented. The act of reading literature brought the social movement inside the reader, which made it inseparable from one's experience of literature. That wove the social movement into my existential self-conception. Of course, I later read Michel Foucault and his US followers, and so learned that subjectivity was the broom of the system, constructed by the system. And yet I was always sure that this was not all subjectivity was. Subjectivity formed via literature in part was also emancipation, the act of inventing emancipation day after day. In her recent book on cynicism, the literary critic Helen Small describes figures like Nietzsche or Diogenes as using cynicism to clear out false arguments in order to liberate the will. This was literature to me, the emancipation of the will, and it was a social will. So indeed, also a construction of discourse and of everything else, and in relation to some kind of reality principle, rather than a narcissistic projection of the kind that daydreaming versions of literature sometimes posit. In sum, the will I thought I was developing by reading literature had several features. It was a continuous personal act of engagement with affects, both repressed and emerging from repression. It was intersubjective. It was constructed. And it combined the flux of subjective experience with the forces that constituted society, its invisible system. And in relation to that system, we would exert our wills. We would exert our wills both in reading about the past and in constructing the future. Reading foretold a collective and not a solitary future. Its approach to the future was through the hidden causes, the normally invisible system, as they worked through intersubjectivity and vice versa. So I never felt any tension between literary study and the study of social systems, even as my placement as a second-generation white middle-class Californian was appearing in the mirror. All university disciplines exist within a social contract in which people are paid mainly to teach undergraduates and yet also to generate knowledge that has social benefits. The UK's research excellence framework has an impact metric that tries to capture that. It doesn't work, as metrics don't, but it does acknowledge that research creates external value in the economist term, otherwise known as public, collective, and indirect benefits. Now, in the humanities, many of us have been tricked into thinking that the so-called public, really multiple diverse publics, see no value or use in the outcomes of the humanities. This is false. It is an illusion of the successful 60-year Gramscian struggle for cultural hegemony waged by the political right. Cultural hegemony takes place in official discourse, and the institutions that disseminate that, particularly the mainstream media. There is a social class, sometimes called the professional managerial class, or the PMC, whose members struggle against other classes, but also against members within their own class for hegemony over the master narratives. Most people are not involved in this struggle for cultural hegemony, as the Democrats have again learned, though they are always addressed by it. But where do people live their lives? Partly in the dominant culture to which they have to react, but also in what Raymond Williams called residual, emergent, and pre-emergent cultures. Literature and the humanities more broadly express all of these cultures, not just the dominant one where factions of capital and the PMC vie for control. When humanities people, as cultural, psychological, sociological hybrid scholars, look at what people say, do, think, and feel, we find another America. This other America is large, sometimes in the majority, sometimes a big minority, depending on the issue. And every single member of the society, in some dimension of their plural selves, is at some points of contact a member of a non-dominant culture in the other America. So please bear this claim in mind as I move on. The humanities assist the emancipation of agency, the self's agency with that of others, outside and inside a dominant culture. And then my second claim is that this plight of every subject leads to demands for knowledge that will allow every subject to actually do this, to negotiate it and exchange as an exchange with others. So I'm now going to posit a short list of popular social demands for knowledge in this domain I've just described. And it's based on a bag of evidence that mixes polling data and tons of reading of both fiction and nonfiction that you are invited to question me about later. These demands are frequently latent, semi-conscious, misdescribed, misrecognized, or unformulated. I've already implied the first. It's a demand for rigorous reading and interpretive methods for understanding complex materials that are riddled with spin, propaganda, deep fakery, text generated by sequence completion algorithms, and every kind of bullshit in the philosophical sense. US politics has been propelled not only by justified anger with the status quo as represented by people like Biden and Harris, but also by a reign of error, basic errors on a mass scale about who holds what position, never mind what a particular position is likely to do. It's not only the PMC that wants to get a better grip on reality. People in general know their ability to survive depends on identifying who's actually hurting them. And that means universal capability with the fine print. Second, and relatedly, there's a popular demand that everyone be able to use technology to satisfy personal, political, and cultural ends and not have these be driven by technology and its platforms. It's not only college writing instructors who worry that GPT-based services will keep their students from learning how to think. Most people dislike technocracy, crap technology like automated checkouts at the supermarket and chatbot customer service. People feel an undefined right to self-determination in technology as much as in everything else. Putting cultural practices, values, and knowledge on an equal footing with technology would receive widespread support if people knew that's a possibility and if they knew there is knowledge that is describing the steps whereby that could happen. Third, many people are interested in living lives not defined by pecuniary goals and economic functions. Yes, they want to be ready for jobs that pay well and for the jobs of the future. They equally want to have lives that aren't in geosynchronous orbit around their jobs. Many people and communities are interested in no longer being damaged by today's version of capitalism. We have an endless variety of literary, philosophical, and historical rejections of capitalist instrumentalism that people actively engage. Much of this involves the critique of capitalism's effects on the inner lives and interpersonal lives of people living in it. Everyday recreation and entertainment expresses the pursuit of happiness, pleasure, and fulfillment very much to one side of capital's imperatives. The effects of a humanities education are powerfully non-pecuniary, and a clear line can be drawn from the things you learn in a history class to this world of ordinary, non-pecuniary experiences and desires for more. 4, political comment focuses on American ethics of aggression and domination, for good reason, but not on the desire for the opposite, starting with the wish not to be dominated by others. This is a feeling that Republicans express nearly as often as Democrats. Not being dominated is a core promise of democracy, if and only if democracy rests on the mutual recognitions of diverse positions and identities. So I posit a widespread interest in reducing our incessant conflicts about whether this or that type of person has the right to exist, to migrate, to diverge in accordance with what they see as an inward need. The US is off the charts the most polarized democracy on earth, with very low levels of trust. This doesn't mean that the population wants this. The only route to depolarization and a functioning democracy is embrace of multiracial society along with a full range of differing standpoints and epistemologies. Getting there from a national condition of anger and fear is going to require humanities knowledge brought to bear, and really on a scale that we've never seen before. 5th, over my decades of teaching, I never met a student that did not seek some version of Bildung or personal development in many dimensions. I've never met a person who didn't want the same thing. People want fulfillment, self-actualization, or whatever term they use. They want the capability, the knowledge, the intelligence, the skills that would allow them to have that. One side here is personal identity. Who am I in this society that seems not to recognize me and may in fact dislike my kind? Another is the ability to think. Am I able to understand the conflicts that shape my life so I can overcome them? Literary criticism has long studied exactly this conjunction of experience, cultural identity, existential questions, language, and thinking. All humanities fields have an indispensable role to play in new formations of consciousness, including those that society desperately needs right now. So I've listed 5 public demands for humanities knowledge, and I'm going to do the screen share buzzkill quite intentionally so I can take a drink of water. Let's try this. So there they are. Okay, so of course people want other things too, like vengeance and the death of their enemies. But these 5 positive demands do live now with very little encouragement from the dominant culture in a half world where the psyche and society interact, and in places that humanities fields designed themselves to understand. Humanities fields are in particular touch with emergent cultures. Their academic disciplines now must have the capacity, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, to make them real to society. Since the 1960s, the culture wars have focused relentlessly on casting the left as a subversive fringe and the right as besieged normalcy. In this model, the left is unpopular and the right is popular. This model has colonized the minds of several generations of opinion makers. I'm going to make the same point that I just made a minute ago. This model is false and the claim is a lie. Emergent cultures, culture as the process of emergence, are at least as popular as the defenses of the residual culture that has become central to electoral politics and politicians. These residual cultures do not, in fact, reflect the thoughts and feelings people have about their lives, where the desire for change, progress, betterment, even revolution is continuous. Culture as emergence is popular, and indeed it is unavoidable on right and left alike, and humanities research should have the scale and the scope to shape it. Okay, so part 2 is after the election. So I'm now going to briefly make that bridge. Okay, it's true that the economy was on the ballot this month. It's true that corporate capitalism is failing most Americans and that they are angry about this. But if the majority wanted to reduce inflation and make things fairer for the working class, they did it in the worst possible way. They just voted for oligarchic capitalism that will make the price of eggs go up and houses go up and insurance go up and medical care go up. They also voted for an openly racist version of cheap eggs and ham, the most openly racist since Alabama Governor George Wallace's campaign in 1968. And they voted for the most misogynist version. White women voted 53-47 for Trump after he lost a civil suit over sexual assault and took their reproductive rights away. There's a lot to say about political economy in America, but the deciding factor in this election was culture. It was a struggle over whose culture is dominant, whose is emergent, and whose is merely residual. 2 images from a great short by Keith Boykin summed it up for me. And here's the first. Let's be real, Trump doesn't represent policy. He represents cultural resentment against the changing America. I think if you need 2 sentences to summarize it, that's the one I would endorse. And I'm also very happy to endorse the facial expressions. The face has been frozen like that for the last 2 weeks. Okay, now the UK political theorist Richard Seymour has upped the ante on all this a bit in a new book called Disaster Nationalism, where he ties the march of the orc armies to Freud's 1930 vision of the blindest frenzy of destructiveness, realizing the right's most extreme omnipotence wishes. Yet the wishes are not fulfilled by the leader's victory and rule. In Seymour's phrase, the more the enemy is crushed, the less victory appears to solve, and the more helpless the victor is in the face of anxiety. There's no built-in endpoint to the spiral, in other words, since no amount of destruction, no totality of victory delivers actual omnipotence. The destructive quest must therefore be perpetually renewed. And in fact, Trump has already begun the escalation, and it will continue to feed upon itself. This is a psychocultural danger in which we are now immersed. It's a planetary danger. So bringing historical and cultural knowledge to bear to at least neutralize it could hardly be more urgent. I mean, what are the humanities for? One thing right now that they are for is making disaster nationalism stop. You all have heard of America's Sputnik moment. The Soviet Union launched the first Earth-orbiting satellite in 1957, and US leaders suddenly felt behind and in desperate need of catching up. The space race was the visible effect, the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo missions that led to the moon landing in 1969. It also created the world's best funded scientific research. The National Science Foundation budget tripled within about 7 years of Sputnik. It was great for science, if not for equality and world peace. Okay, today we are in a pretty obvious Sputnik moment for culture. I mean, I don't love the militarist term, but this is where we are. The Sputnik moment didn't start this month. Its seeds were planted around the time of Sputnik itself. A powerful part of US culture remains a 1950s white Cold War culture. It enables McCarthyism and witch hunts. It is also technocratic in the sense that C.P. Snow popularized as the better of his two cultures. That is, science that looks forward and improves the world versus literature that looks backward and complains about it. It is also, this culture, anti-communist and anti-New Deal, or anti-social democracy, and sees these two things, communism and liberalism, as the same. It expresses itself on the home front as white patriarchy, very raced, very gendered, and very defensive when this is pointed out. It is run by captains of industry, even if that industry is real estate. Donald Trump is straight out of this 1950s, and he has always been at war with the 1960s and everything that has happened since. He embraces a residual culture, and he is angry about the fact that it is not dominant. This culture is in its decadent phase, where upholding it requires prodigious energies of destruction and also of psychic dissociation, and also of repression of the majority culture embodied in multicultural America. In spite of the majority vote for Trump, the culture he represents has been losing its status as the dominant culture for decades, and that is not registered in voting numbers, but in terms of where people look in order to understand themselves and to see a desirable future. Science Sputnik meant the Soviets have a satellite and we don't. Cultural Sputnik means the minority culture, MAGA, has seized the state and the majority culture has not. We should see this not only as a political, but also as a scholarly and an intellectual problem. The power of destruction that it contains makes it a cultural emergency. We know the Steve Bannon practice of flooding the zone with shit. The humanities need to now to work on the reverse practice. We need to recall knowledge needs that do exist in society, but that have been flooded with shit and are now invisible. The humanities are for reading out this half-known actual life of people's experiences as told in their records. The humanities are for making their psychologies and their sociologies simultaneously visible and visible for each other. The humanities cannot simply drain the zone, but now must build another zone altogether. Okay, so this is where we come to the third section. It's a bit longer than this last one, and it involves these charts. And this is going to be a bit much, so bear with me. And I don't know if there's some way to stop me in chat or slow me down, but I don't know. I'm always happy to be interrupted with this stuff. And usually online, my compromise is to interrupt myself. So I will try not to do in the interest of time. Anyway, here we go. So the question now is, how can the humanities do that, do this big social project in relation to cultural emergency? We're going to need to take two steps that academic humanists are normally very reluctant to take. We need to organize the analysis and critique we already have into a much more coherent body of knowledge than we currently have, with all of its internal differences, not suppressed, but organized some better way. This is the first step. This means creating an archive of our research along the lines of the National Bureau of Economic Research. We need one for cultural research, like an NBCR. Over time, we'll need to build this into a counter model, as the Mount Pelerin Society and the Chicago School of Economics, along with many others, did for neoliberalism. This will generate cultural systems that are alternative to the dominant one, our current mix that we might call oligarchic and corporate post-democratic capitalism, OCPC, which is an acronym that is not going to be catching on. You get the general territory. It's this emergent culture that's been continuously dragged backwards, especially by presidential elections. And this has been going on in the United States really since 1972. Building cultural systems from the many elements that we already have, this project I just named, is going to take 20 or 30 years. But the first phase, that structured national archive, can be done in 4. But there's a prior step behind the National Archive, the knowledge base, the knowledge world that is there, that's real, that people can access. So let's call it step 0. And that is to build an educational and communications infrastructure to create it and transmit it, starting with research. Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall and many others have described education and communications jointly, not seeing them as two separate systems. Describe them as linked elements in the long revolution, Williams's phrase, towards full cultural democracy. Okay. The right thinks we've already done this. That is, that we've made the universities into a liberal Marxist alternative universe in which we indoctrinate our students fully. They're obviously wrong about this. Yet academic humanists have somewhat similarly assumed that the university is, in fact, our research and communications infrastructure. We too are wrong about this. The university belongs not to its students and scholars, but to its governing boards and senior administrators. The university's communication systems are 2 decades out of date. And most importantly, the humanities research base is a century out of date. So I'm going to put these issues in monetary terms. I mean, I'm a materialist, and money powerfully affects, it doesn't linearly determine, it's an interactive model that I have in my head. But money does powerfully affect the mass subjectivity of the humanities. It affects its ambition, and it affects its confidence. I mean, there are so many issues here: precarity, mental health, racism, and many others. And I'm going to stick with numbers here for the interest of time, partly, but also just as proxies for these things, and also for like an actual representation for the limits that money put on our capability, lack of money in particular. Okay, so on to these limits, these lacks. Just a bit of background. The United States is the biggest spender on research and development, or R&D, in the world, with China now a close number 2. Most of this expenditure is for experimental development. That is 67% of this R&D money. And for applied research, which is another 18%, meaning that only 15% of R&D in the US overall is spent on basic research. A lot of this is subsidy to industry, in other words. While 75% of overall R&D is performed by business, the federal government is the biggest performer of basic research, about half in 2021, 46% to be exact. Okay, so this is a big deal because it means that disciplines with little or no commercial potential are likely to get nearly all of their funding from government rather than from business. Business, by definition, looks for financial return on investment, not to make a contribution to human knowledge. Essentially, all humanities scholarship is basic research. Its effects are mostly non-pecuniary. They are also spread across individuals and society. Advanced literacy makes it easier for the individual to get a good job, for example, and also for society to produce complex services and have mass democratic deliberation. The same goes for understanding the relation between capitalism and colonialism. This knowledge isn't directly monetizable, but it allows society to hold together over time and perhaps even to progress. Given this non-commercial status of nearly all humanities scholarship, the amount governments spend on it is a burning interest. Of the 54 billion or so in university research the government funds, 69 million goes to the humanities. That is, the humanities receive 0.13% of the federal total. This is, in other words, less, or it's about 0.1%. And it's a nearly invisible slice of the overall federal research pie. Let's take a look at this. We can, slides are going downhill. Basically, life sciences, which is heavily medical, engineering, physical sciences, the green line, and then everything else sort of disappears in the archaeological layers beneath. If you looked at the budget for the National Endowment for the Humanities, that is the NEH, you'll notice that the 69 million that I just mentioned is less than the NEH's overall fiscal year 2023 budget of 207 million. And there is a reason for this. The NEH spends only a fraction of its overall funding on actual research, about 37 million that year by my calculation. Here's a divergent knowledge systems, different financial planets, different ability to basically do every kind of collaboration and dissemination project. It's what you're looking at there. The federal government appears not to consider the NEH a research funding agency at all, likely because it spends less than 100 million per year on research. The Congressional Research Service's report on federal R&D identifies budgets for 14 federal research agencies, and yet NEH and NEA are not among them. So what this means is that a large amount of valuable humanities research goes unfunded by outside agencies. And just to give a personal example, in 2017, I was lucky enough to get an NEH collaborative research grant to study the effects of quantification on the humanities in higher ed. This is arguably the NEH program that most resembles the research that is routine in science and engineering. I was trying to hire postdocs, RAs, do travel and dissemination, et cetera, the kind of stuff that's completely routine in STEM. But in the entire United States, there were a total of 9 collaborative awards that year. In other words, in a country that has over 166,000 humanities instructors in tertiary education, there were 9 awards, which is just delirious that this is like supporting research. Most worthy research in the humanities goes unfunded, and much of that unfunded research is unperformed. If it is performed, it is most often self-funded out of the scholar's own pocket, and as a result, is shrunken and slowed. One way to remember the general rule is not the golden rule, is in round numbers. Universities spend about $100 billion on research every year from all sources, not just the feds. 1/10 of that goes to all non-STEM fields as a group, social sciences included, so 9/10 goes to STEM. And then 1/10 of these non-STEM funds go to the humanities disciplines. So there's a tacit 1% rule for the humanities, with that 1% as a ceiling and not a floor. Remember that 0.13. Okay, so let's say, well, government doesn't really do much for academic humanities research. So this research is basically up to academia to support. And academia does spend an enormous amount of money supporting research. I mentioned that of the nearly 100 billion that universities spent on research in 2022, 54 of that came from the federal government. So there's a big chunk that feds did not fund. Another 25 billion came from the universities themselves. It's called institutional funds by the Higher Education R&D Survey or HERD survey that the NSF must conduct by law. This means that more than 25 cents of every research dollar spent at universities comes out of universities' own pockets. So surely in that 25 billion, there's a lot of money being spent on humanities research, not funded by the feds, but funded by campuses, right? I mean, the idea here is that universities fill in gaps in government spending, they complement the government's priorities in order to sort of balance out the fact that the federal government is totally obsessed with defense and economic outcomes of the research that it funds. Okay, so time for a couple of charts with some selected institutions that will clarify a couple of overall points about this situation. Okay, this is, there's 6 universities here. These are research expenditures by major funding source. This is taken directly from NSF data that's reported out by hundreds of universities all around the country. So these are based on what the universities say about themselves. The feds are not really calculating this or checking up on it. And I've assembled some of the categories, if any of you have looked at these tables. So we have 3. We have the government, which I've rolled state into federal. We have the green, which is business and nonprofits also bundled together. Business never really gets out of single digits. It was supposed to be a big replacement for the state. It's never been that, except that really a very small number of places. And then the gray, which is what we're interested in, are institutional funds, which are basically the university's money that they spend. And there's a few things to notice here. The first, apparently similar universities like Berkeley and Michigan, or Princeton and Stanford, have divergent levels of expenditure, height of the bars, and also the ratios within them. I mean, medical centers explain much of this. Berkeley does not have a medical school, Stanford does, but by no means explains all of the variance. The second issue is the gray band, the institutional funds money that is the universities. Universities spend just piles of money out of their own pockets supporting this research. So it's 210 million at Berkeley, 169 million at Stanford, and a pretty incredible 612 million of institutional funds at the University of Michigan, research powerhouse. But it turns out that more than a third of Michigan's research funding is its own money. And interestingly, I was just checking on this. This is also true on a smaller scale at UMass Amherst. 1/3 is institutional funds of the total research expenditure. Given these large amounts of internal spending on research and the high dollar extramural funding of STEM fields, one might revert to the consoling belief that I mentioned above that there'd be plenty of money for these non-STEM fields. I mean, but in reality, how do non-STEM fields in the humanities fare? So here's another slide. Same institutions, now each institution gets 2 bars. Okay, so taking the gray bar horizontally, that band, I should say, turned it into a bar on the right-hand side. And then, so that's all institutional funds. The left-hand bar for each university, which has multi-colors that you can't see very well, is all expenditures from all sources. So there's a little bit of a glitch here that we don't have to worry about in a moment, on non-STEM fields. So the right-hand bar is all institutional funding, the left-hand bar is non-STEM research. Okay. You'll notice that the right-hand bar for each institution is much taller than the left-hand bar. So this leads to our third observation. Universities spend much more of their own funds on research, STEM and non-STEM together, than they spend on non-STEM research from all sources. Institutional funds are used mainly to support STEM research. So the hope we were having before is already not being borne out. This is actually a deeper point than it might seem, and it leads to a fourth observation. Universities spend much more of their institutional funds supporting the research that almost always already has extramural funding than universities spend on the research that almost always lacks extramural funding. So on the slide, the orange, in other words, it's like it amplifies an inequity rather than corrects for it. On the slide, the orange bands denote the humanities. There's the best case of Michigan and decent showings from Princeton and Irvine. On the other hand, the University of Oregon, with its excellent humanities center and affiliated scholars, spends 1/55 of its institutional funds on the humanities. The humanities share of all institutional expenditures at these schools are as follows: Berkeley 1.9, Irvine 6.1, Princeton 10.6, Oregon 0.2, Michigan 4%, and Stanford, matching the feds in a race to the bottom, 0.2. These numbers are small. Only 11 universities spent 10 million or more on the humanities in 2022. Spending 2 million that year puts a university in the top 100. My former institution, UC Santa Barbara, spending 1.7 million on humanities research, was ranked 108th. My first tenure track job was at Rice University, a very wealthy private institution in Houston, Texas, America's most underrated city, by the way. It spent 1.3 million on the humanities, placing it 131st. After institutions 140 and 141, the University of Oregon and the University of Connecticut, each campus spent less than 1 million per year on humanities research. And remember, I'm using the term research broadly because much of this money, and this is a detail that maybe I shouldn't even toss in here, but it's becoming increasingly important. Much of this money now goes to staffing offices that administer humanities activities that are funded elsewhere, rather than actually going directly to the people who are conducting research and for their direct expenses. Not only is Stanford down there at the bottom, it's placed 222nd, but the University of Chicago, which is this famous humanities and social sciences bastion, is also in this bottom category, spending $882,000 per year on the humanities for 149th place. Such data really do make one wonder about institutional priorities, but let's keep going. Okay. Nearly every administrator or humanities leader that I've ever spoken to believes that this whole discussion that we're now having is a third rail in higher education politics. STEM research earns the big outside grants, they say, and they also get the big internal grants. They have equipment needs and also donor support. So naturally, that's where the money goes. I agree that we've allowed research funding to be a third rail and thus to damage higher education budgets for generations, but I disagree with its rationality. Extramural grants with high facilities and administrative costs lose money for their universities on buildings, on extra staff, on utilities, on everything that isn't given by the funder just for the direct and immediate cost of that particular grant. Universities then have to spend their own money to make up the difference. The difference is, it's 25 cents on the dollar. They spend institutional funds on STEM because STEM brings in a lot of money and loses a lot of money. They have, in many cases, little left over to spend on non-STEM research that cannot get outside grants, even though the monies required there are pretty small. Universities spend most of their internal research funds, as you can see on this graph, adding to the extramural funds that STEM grants have already received. That's what you're looking at here. Okay, let me just do a quick comparison. The United Kingdom has a much more centralized statistical state, and it also has more brutal candor about the fiscal crisis in its higher ed sector and had an adversarial central government for years, and they publish this data. And here's what you see in the UK. They lose the same amount of money on research. And that is here. The sector as a whole, 130 universities in the UK, something like that, lost $5 billion net, brought in, if you look at gross, it's really big, it's very positive. Net negative £5 billion. How do they pay for this? Well, they do what the US and Canada did, which is pile in as many international students as they can and charge them as much as they can. Double in the UK, triple in places like California. And it still wasn't enough. And so they're still losing this money. I'm throwing this up as evidence that a relatively honest accounting in the United States is likely to produce exactly the same result as the fairly draconian accounting that you get in the UK. Okay, I want to mention really quickly another twist, which is important for me to use a term I'm going to use in a minute, which is budget injustice. Where do these subsidy revenues, the institutional funds, come from? When we say money comes in the university's own pocket, what does that actually mean? At public universities especially, they come almost entirely from students. Mostly undergraduates are paying. They either through enrollment-based state allocations. If you're a resident, the state sends money based on your history as a state taxpayer, et cetera. And also on your tuition fees. So most of the cost of STEM research is cross-subsidized by revenues from instruction, which come, ultimately from students and taxpayers in some conjoinment. And much or most of instruction, here's the next piece of this. This depends on the institution. Much or most of instruction, if we count enrollments, comes from non-STEM fields, especially the social sciences, but also the humanities and the arts. Since a good share of institutional funds are earned by instruction in non-STEM fields, the many students who pay money to study sociology, economics, history of art, philosophy, et cetera, these fields do in fact have a claim to receive a solid share of those funds for their research that produces the knowledge that they are then communicating to their students back in the classroom. As I noted above, you can get some sense of how they are doing by comparing the bars in slide 9. They're receiving a fractional return. Now I'm talking about undergraduates on their investment of their funds and some taxpayer money together. The University of California as a system spent 0.5% of its total research expenditures on the arts and the humanities together in 2018, 2019. They were allocating about 26 million to those fields out of about 49 billion that year. After that year, UC simply stopped reporting arts and humanities funding. So here's what we see. You see the university duplicating the inequalities of funding on the federal level, not fighting it in some way or compensating for it. This is 2020. Got arts and humanities here. Skip forward 2 years, and it's just gone. Too small. That's part of it. Haven't been able to get an answer. Nonetheless, it's goodbye. In some, humanities fields are underfunded both in proportion to other fields and in proportion to their contribution to the revenues that make up the institutional funds that they're mostly not getting. There is budgetary injustice here. There's injustice for our students, for our academic staff, and for our disciplines in their intellectual lives. Universities do spend an enormous amount of money of their own money on research, just not on research on culture, history, society, people. Intellectual marginality, as we experience it often, comes from resource poverty. It's not the only reason we have an unhinged culture, but it's a big one that we could actually do something about. Okay, so last section, I'm gonna stop the share. Okay, yes, I did. Okay, so in conclusion, what are the humanities fields to do about our cultural emergency given the precarity of our workers, our culture war embattlement, our lack of research infrastructure, and the omerta that veils our funding structures. I mean, we have a cultural emergency, but we're broke. So I've already described a national campaign for funding justice. The current state of deliberate fiscal secrecy puts the entire burden of campaigning for funding justice, or just basic funding transparency, squarely on the shoulders of those who do know. And these people are humanities managers of all kinds. These are deans, provosts, humanities center directors, some departmental chairs, as well as the directors and presidents of national associations and foundations like the NEH, the Modern Language Association, the Mellon Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the National Humanities Alliance, the American Historical Association, the National Humanities Center, and so on. What have they been doing about underfunding? And what will they do now, much more importantly, with the current cultural emergency? The traditional failure of administrators to speak out has itself been a message. It tells the world that the humanities fields don't really have funding problems. In the absence of positive knowledge about crying material needs, the public discussion defaults to not enough majors and too many PhDs. This erases the causal link between comparatively low research funding and low public visibility. In the resulting vacuum of material information, the interested public gets distracted by theory wars, alleged internal intellectual flaws, charges of overly liberal politics, and anything else that can be used to blame the fiscal victims. Most of the humanities deans and other officials I've known say that any discussion of funding shortfalls will backfire. They thus take on the role of first suppressors. The claim is that unless we are neither seen nor heard, we will be zeroed out. All such officials I've known are sincere, dedicated, intelligent people. And on this issue, they are completely wrong. Humanities federal funding already rounds to zero. Unless they reverse their own omerta, absolute zero is what we'll get. Humanities administrators and national organizations must now campaign to construct the research infrastructure that both society and scholars need. I already outlined a couple of basic steps. National debate about what the data means for intellectual life in the humanities, for the research results of the discipline, and for the social knowledge that issues the humanities research now has to take place. Tell the faculty and faculty and students need to be told what is going on and need to be able to tell others what is happening. We need to bring staff into the cause. We need to rally the base. We need to create disruption of the current model. In trying to regularize basic things like data collection, analysis, reporting, and related functions, we need to be aware that campus officials often have their hands tied by their own bosses. Academia is now generally operated with a corporate chain of command, where a dean who calls for glasnost or enacts it on their own is courting marginalization, budget reduction, or firing. Administrative service generally entails a de facto loyalty oath to fiscal secrecy. Academic freedom does not exist in the financial and administrative sides of the university. Individual faculty members face a similar risk. The risk is worse for professional staff who can be moved or fired at will. The only internal remedy is a steady, relentless campaign of institutional education about the need for the open circulation of information and the duty of universities to protect the people who do it. That means expanding academic freedom from tenured faculty to NTT faculty, to professional staff, and to people that are involved in administrative work. This campaign will need to happen for months or years or however long it takes. I know a couple of deans who are trying to do this. I mean, literally, I know two. So far, they have received little support from their peers. That is going to have to change. We will need to change the language game in institutions where shunning, exclusion, or removal are normal and deniable responses to dissent. Faculty will need to go beyond expressions of regret for the bad job market and program closures at less fortunate colleges and engage in what Isabelle Bruno calls stats activism, data activism of the kind that has become common in relation to social media, large language models,
police violence, privacy, capital projects, and pretty much everything else in our organizational world. Without humanities-based stats activism directed towards ourselves as well as outward, and in relation to our working conditions, national humanities leadership and administrators will in effect collaborate with special austerity for their disciplines, intensify adjunctification, and keep everyone silent about the 1% rule for research funding, soon to be the 0% rule under Trump. In real terms, NEH is already funded at less than half its 1980 level. Our current strategy needs a complete revision. In short, academia needs a cultural change on talking about money, as well as seeing the humanities as a research operation. Graduate student unionization efforts have helped a lot, and tenured faculty, administrative, and national humanities leaders now need to help as well. We know that humanities fields have enormous value exactly as they are. But if we want them to be on the front line of creating public knowledge that can address our current cultural disaster, we must rebuild our cultural disciplines. And we can do this, but we need to start this right now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was a truly powerful and inspiring lecture, and it has already generated a number of questions in the chat, and we invite everybody who is attending to submit questions using the webinar chat. Please do so. We already have a number, and we would like to. We will be asking them, and I actually wanted to start out with a question that both repackages my own, and also came up, and it was something that you discussed right at the end. How does the academic labor movement fit in here? You talked a little bit about that at the end. Can you talk a little bit more about how the academic labor movement assists the process, how the vision and the work that you just outlined may be different from what the academic labor movement can provide?
Yeah, I would see it as a expansion on this really important work that's already happening. So what they've done across the country is get data on a detailed level. It allows them to look at salary issues, across disciplines, across campuses, et cetera, and to then negotiate for changes in that based on actual financial information that the university is required to give them as part of a collective bargaining process. The issues that are being worked on through unionization tend not, this may vary from state to state in ways that I don't fully understand, but in California, there's a barrier between salary and other kinds of direct, benefits kind of conditions, issues, and the academic questions that we're talking about. So, for example, the UC strikes a couple of years ago, the graduate student union wanted to negotiate input into the structuring of classes and curriculum, and it was just completely eliminated by the university from discussion as something that collective bargaining doesn't cover.
Right.
So it's a model that I think needs to be built on, but the building on that has to happen.
And so another point that has come up in one of the questions. So you point out, right, that universities do have money to spend on research, but that it is not spent on the humanities. And one question points out that in the last year or so, especially going back to an article that Nathan Heller published in the New Yorker about the so-called end of the English major, we've had a kind of a national discussion, which has filtered into departments around this country, about declining undergraduate majors as sort of the core problem which humanities fields must solve. Can you talk a little bit about that framing? And because it seems like what you've just told us suggests that there's some key shortcomings to this focus on undergraduate majors and their falling numbers.
Yeah, I mean, the basic differences between majors and enrollments. So
Right.
workload should be calculated by enrollments, how many students are in your courses. You have to, if you're teaching a history class, you're also grading people who are majoring in chemistry and economics as much as you are grading people that are majoring in history. So the reason that I focus on majors is partly a data problem because federal data doesn't have good enrollment numbers nationally. I mean, this is, again, I mean, it's 50 states and just never managed to do it properly. So actually, I ended up having a conversation with Nathan Heller about his piece, and he said that they tried, and the New Yorker fact checker people tried to get the Humanities Indicators Project to swap out major numbers with enrollments, and they couldn't do it. They just couldn't get the data properly. So they ended up sticking with what they could get. And I mean, a lot of people are skeptical about enrollments because, oh, well, you're forcing people to take this because you have these distribution requirements, whereas major is a real market signal, actual student interest, which translates in some sense to social importance. And it's that last step, I think, is completely wrong. I mean, students have been propagandized out of taking the humanities as really bad for their fiscal health in the future, which they're understandably totally worried about, and also as not producing real knowledge. And so the argument I'm making here is build research output, make it clear to students as well as society that these are active fields that are generating knowledge for humanity and not just for themselves and their conferences, although that's important too.
Yeah.
And then students will come back.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, while we're rebuilding majoring and also making majoring more interesting and interdisciplinary and so on, we really have to use enrollment data instead.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, just one last thing about it. When I did this study at UCSB, our majors went, the majors in the whole Humanities and Fine Arts division went down 25%, while enrollments went down 0%.
Right.
They were just flat. Enrollments went up in other divisions, so that's also what provosts are looking at. But it's a completely different picture if you look at actual workload and what we have to do.
Right. Yeah. Right. Workload. Exactly. You know, one question that has come up, which I think is been something that I think a number of folks have been talking about since the election, is the growing xenophobia of federal policies toward research and education at the same time as American universities are increasingly dependent on international students for tuition revenues, but also I would add to the question that one of the big attractions of the American universities has been its research enterprise, and that has attracted, so many brilliant students from all over the world. What should we, as scholars in the humanities, do to think about responding to this?
We just fight it completely. I mean, I feel really unambivalently, but we just stake our position, not compromise. I mean, compromise is just really a sucker's game at this point. And, if Mitt Romney were the Republican president, maybe, and if there weren't 40 years of incessant attempts to, delete the NEH and the NEA and all the other kind of propaganda wars that we've been going through, then I would say, oh, let's just sit down and we'll come to that's not going to happen. So I think it's instead better to carve out a sustainable, reasonable, not crazy, but nonetheless strongest possible position, and just advocate for it, explain why it's right, do the thing that we know how to do, which is argue, evidence, persuasion, and also direct it in different venues outside of the echo chamber that we often are confronted with.
Right. Another question
I think
that
a
has
lot of this is taking a strong message to a wider audience rather than diluting the message for a different audience, particularly for an administrative one. I just don't think that works.
Right. Yeah. Another question that has come in actually from Ellen Schrecker Hi, Alan. Is about publishing, and where academic publishing fits into this. One aspect I think of this crisis has also been the crisis of the university presses, which are so essential to the ecosystem of humanities knowledge production. And we've seen presses face many fiscal crises. We've talked, and we have other discussions about the increasing costs of academic monographs and decreasing library budgets. What about that side of things?
That has to be exposed also.
Yeah.
I mean, I mean, at some level, I don't know, like I'm a child of Watergate, and maybe that's all. Democracy dies in darkness, humanities die in darkness. Nobody knows. Humanities centers die, residential facilities get deleted like 6 months before a single humanities professor has heard that it's happened.
Right.
Same is happening with presses.
Right.
I mean, who's talking about the cutting of subsidies, the small amounts of money that go to subsidizing presses? We heard about one case, we heard about Stanford, because the provost was clumsy enough just to blurt it out because she thought it was such a great idea. And there was, resistance that then made it into a national issue. And also it was Stanford, a less visible school would have a much harder time ginning up interest. So, I mean, this is where non-disclosure, the silence policy is just, is a self-inflicted wound that we won't recover from unless we stop doing it.
Right. Right.
The point also of comparing humanities funding to science funding is not to say science should have less money. They're super important too, and I especially am fond of electrical engineering for some reason. But there has to be an understanding of the sacrifice. If you need more indirect cost recovery money because your engineering lab is losing money, you can take money away from the humanities in a way that destroys the press or destroys an entire department in order to keep this lab running for another 4 months. I mean, it's just, and if we can't see the overall financial picture, we're going to continue to make terrible decisions like that.
Right.
And
Right.
if we see how inexpensive university presses are in the bigger picture, we'll do a better job fighting for them.
Right. Absolutely. Another question that comes in here. So one question that we have is that, you say that Republicans think we have already created a coherent body of knowledge designed to convert people to leftist liberal perspectives, but that in fact we haven't, and we should. Does this under-recognize
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, well, that would help us.
No, I don't do
maybe
conversion.
Right. Okay. So you're not saying that.
No,
So
I'm a
now we
really
can.
conservative teacher, actually.
Oh,
But
okay.
go finish your question.
Right. Well, so I think that I think that what this question is trying to get at is, so, one of the things that we in the humanities have done is supported and been a kind of a lab for thinking for social justice movements, the very social justice movements that now are under intense attack at both the federal level and the state level. And with that, what do you think about the opportunities to reknit our scholarship and our activism together in a way that can mutually support social movements? I think this is kind of what the question is getting at, while also stealing, I think, in some ways, for the reaction that can come, especially from state legislatures when the scholars involved are at public universities.
I have a two-sided comment on this. One is, I think, as you can tell from my first section, that the two just sort of live together because we study humanity and humanities doing social movements, and there's just this constant life together. that can't really just be parceled up in these packages. And this is one of the things we've become more sophisticated about on a philosophical level over the last 100 years. So I hate the dualisms that are part of the humanities. Don't do context, do text, or it's just, or if you're doing cultural studies, don't do literature. I mean, I think both of those positions are just wrong, and because everything is very holistic, it just comes spontaneously about how I see things interconnecting, and I attribute it to that early reading. Here's the other side, though. Classroom organizing, these are different spaces. And I'm conservative in the classroom, meaning it's really like argument and evidence. And did you read this text properly? And no, you're wrong about this sentence. I have absolutely I have no qualms asserting the privileges of knowledge in relation to gaps in it in the classroom context. Right. And so this does not mean that I'm not interested in the experiences of my students, which are different from mine, all the different perspectives that come in. I mean, that's all fantastic. But the academic model of processing information has to be maintained. And it's the reason that I sort of grew up in back office Hollywood, and I left that in order to go to the university because I did not like the world of spin and propaganda,
Yes.
public publicity, and bullshitting that makes that world go around. So I was like, oh, truth. And then I, read Foucault, and truth is power. There's all these complexities, and I don't deny any of those. And I loved all that stuff that I learned about the ambiguities and the interaction between action and thought, and how activism and the university are together. And at the same time, I think that academic modalities and inquiry, investigation, and so on have to be articulated and developed and preserved.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question that has come in is about the possibilities of building solidarities between university level humanities instructors and teachers in secondary and elementary schools, especially who are also facing a barrage of right-wing attacks and coercive attacks on their academic freedom through these impositions of, things like these Stop Woke teaching acts and other types of legislation, as well as investigation from right-wing legislators on their teaching. What do you think about how we can, as educators at whatever level we're working at, build solidarities to push back on this?
Okay, that question, which is a very important one, is a good example of what I'm talking about around funding. When I was working on, I don't know, innovation theory, I had this strange period in the 2000s, and I was a co-PI on a enormous engineering grant in the National Science Foundation to study nanotechnology in society. We had about $150,000 a year for 5 years to spend on doing nothing but dissemination, and most of that was supposed to be take the equipment to the library, tell the interested public what you're working on, bring the school children into the laboratory and talk about how interesting knowledge is. The relationship between primary and secondary school teachers and the university it's not, can we do this? It's, we've been doing it for decades. And here's, by the way, here's $1.2 billion that the NSF spent in 2022 for science education. Most of that not being spent, I don't actually know, quite a bit of it not being spent at universities at all, but in the secondary school system. So it's a great, we have to do that. We can only do it if we can get funded to do it. We can't all work 85 hours a week on 3 different unpaid jobs. There has to be an infrastructure built so that there are people that keep the circulation around academic freedom around trans rights and how to deal with critics of that, around the whole thing in constant motion. And it just, we need to budget for it and ask for it and demand it and advocate and struggle. But there has to be a very clear goal of having adequate support for doing these really important things that we've been talking about my whole career.
Exactly. Exactly.
We all want to do it. There's just no ambivalence about it. It's just how. And the how is the
Absolutely.
money.
Exactly. And tonight, this afternoon, depending on where in the world you are, we've heard Christopher Newfield really lay out, I think, a very inspiring plan for us to think about how we move forward. And it is up to us to organize ourselves to make this happen. And these are conversations that those of us who are concerned about this, and I think that it's the vast majority, need to be pushing our departments, our professional organizations, our colleagues to engage in. And with that, I want to thank everybody for being here, and especially thank Christopher Newfield. It's really been an honor to be in conversation with you and to host this vital capstone that rounds out our fall semester's Feinberg Series exploration of the historical roots of present-day social, political, and ethical crises in higher ed. And all of the events have been recorded, and they'll be available on the Feinberg Series website to be rewatched and continue to be thought about and talked about. And while we'll be on hiatus for winter break, we will be returning in the spring semester with workshops on campus here at UMass, but also panels, a lecture, and other roundtables that will be also broadcast on Zoom. So we hope that everybody around the world will attend. And then the series will resume on Thursday, February 13th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, when we'll be hosting an expansive dialogue with Tristan Atone and Kei Wing Yang on the historical and present-day relationships of U.S. universities to Indigenous peoples and how universities can be accountable to the land and to Indigenous peoples, facilitated by UMass Professor Abigail Chapik-Noy. For now, I want to thank again, truly, Christopher Newfield for this brilliant lecture, and to wish everybody a very good evening or good day wherever you are in the world, and to keep up the fight for the humanities and for public education everywhere. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, Asheesh. Thanks, everyone. Be in touch.